I want to especially welcome you all to this very important session. And you would agree with me that this is a very important session because we're talking about food and Nigeria's food security systems. My name is Temi Adegore. I'm the managing partner at SAI Consulting, and I will be leading you through this session as the facilitator of the session. Before I start, I would like to invite the discussion leads for this session to come join me here on in front. Mr. Rufus Idris. Mr. Rufus Idris is the country director of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Please give him a round of applause. Mr. Akinka Akintunde is the CEO at AFS Commodity Exchange Limited. Akin. Let me also invite Ms. Abiba Suleiman, the development manager at TGI Group. Okay. Please, can you bring up the slides, please? I would like to start the session by just running through a few slides, and these slides are reminders. Just reminding us on where we are and why this session is very critical. The next slide, please. You will all agree with me that we're in some very, challenging moments in our food, in our drive for food security in Nigeria. Nigeria's food security crisis it's a critical aspect of our country's broader social and economic instability that we're facing. And it's presented us a situation that we like to describe as a trilemma. We call it a trilemma of food affordability, accessibility, and availability. And it has been noted as of Q1 2024, this year, that the number of food insecure Nigerians rose very high, significantly. We had about 100 million people who are facing severe food insecurity issues. The situation is not looking nice, and we need to, really come together and join our hands together to ensure that we address this, address issues within this very important sector. Let me walk you through a little bit. Let me walk you through the food insecurity milestones of Nigeria. They are milestones. Unfortunately, they are not very nice milestones. Between 2010 and 2020, we experienced heightened conflicts, insecurity in our communities, exacerbated by, issues of climate challenges. Between 2021 and 2023, it was, post-COVID pandemic. We suffered escalated, food crisis due to disruptions of supply chain, global supply chains, even local supply chains. By 2024, we now have huge gaps in our food systems, and we have a lot of hunger gaps and acute malnutrition. And the Global Hunger Index report for 2023 actually ranked Nigeria 109 out of 125 countries. So definitely we are in some very serious moments that require, serious considerations if we're going to get out of these doldrums. Just imagine if, you can go to the next slide, and the next slide after this one. Just imagine if in cassava we can achieve about 40 tons per hectare instead of 18. Imagine if we can achieve about 13 tons per hectare of rice and maize. Imagine if we can achieve about 38 tons per hectare of tomato. Imagine if our cows can provide us with about 30 liters of milk a day compared to 1.5 liters of milk that our cows provide. So when you look at that slide on the right, you'll see the huge demand and supply gaps that we currently have across the very critical staple crops. Next slide, please. But the National Food Systems Profile of Nigeria has actually revealed that we have serious gaps in the institutional policy, industrial coordination, and governance framework of our food systems, of our food ecosystem. And those gaps have been summarized into 5 key areas. We have persistent structural vulnerabilities, which we've seen very clearly from our heavy dependence on oil revenue, very heavy dependence on food imports, where we have the potential to actually produce the food that we need and possibly export to other countries. We have socioeconomic vulnerabilities, and about 133 million people are living in extreme multidimensional poverty. We've been experiencing low yields, but we're still experiencing a lot of low yields on our farms because we have issues in our seed systems. Many of our farmers do not have access to the right inputs for food production. And we have execution gaps. That has been really clear from the way we've gone by our analysis and design of policies, and actually how we even implement policies in agriculture. We have a lot of funding shortages. We have weak coordination. We have a situation where a lot of us don't even understand where policies or policy implementation and design for agriculture sits. You see, within the presidency or with the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Budget and Economic Planning. So there are quite a number of intergovernmental responsibilities in food systems, and it makes it really very complex to really understand to understand who to hold accountable. And all of this has actually led us to a triple burden of malnutrition. And according to GAIN, we have about 34% of our children in Nigeria who are currently stunted, 11.5% wasted, and about 25.5% underweight. So these are serious issues. Now, the government has responded. Please go to the next slide. The government responded, and there are some very specific moves that the government has made in the last few months. First was the declaration of the state of emergency on food security by Mr. President. We have the presidential declaration of fuel subsidy removal and a lot of international agricultural partnerships and engagements that has really brought in a lot of investment into the space in the last few months. The responses are good, but implementation has not been very efficient. And we understand as Nigerians that in implementation lies many of the issues that we currently face. But we see it at the NESG, at Sahel Consulting, we see that what we need is actually a food systems approach that is able to match the quantum or the scale of the risks and the vulnerabilities that we currently have. So I've highlighted on this slide a number of areas: land security issues, seed security issues. We were just discussing this morning before we started, what is going on within our seed sector and how we've not been able to actually, liberate private seed companies to be able to take the lead on that. And we haven't still been able to achieve a transparent, resilient, a competitive seed sector that would ensure that our smallholder farmers have access to the right seeds, superior genetic materials. We have soil security issues. We have harvest and post-harvest issues. Today, our post-harvest losses range between 40 and 60%, depending on the value chain you're talking about. Value chains of highly perishable food commodities, can be as high as 60%. In root and tubers, we're recording about 40%. I was discussing with someone very recently about the post-harvest losses situation in yam, and it's about 40%. So it means that we're producing about 60 metric tons of yam annually. 40% of that goes to waste. So 40% goes to waste. Another chunk would go, through cross-border informal trades to other neighboring countries. So what do we have left to eat in Nigeria? And that's why a tuber of yam can go as high as 1,000 naira or 1,500 naira sometimes. We have serious mechanization gaps. And as we speak today, we do not even have, the right policy for mechanization. How do we support our, local allied equipment fabricators in Nigeria to ensure that we have our own equipment for agricultural production in Nigeria? We cannot continue to rely on China to import, agricultural machinery. Agricultural extension penetration is a huge, huge problem. And we've gotten to that point where the ratio of, an extension agent to farmer is between one extension, agent to close to 2,000 farmers. And we need to start to think about how we see agricultural extension officers as farmer business advisors and not necessarily, government extension agents. And also we have issues of water security. So when we look at all of these issues from a value chain, a food systems perspective, then we understand that this is the right approach that is comprehensive enough to be able to allow us to respond to the risks and the vulnerabilities that we face. The next slide, please. So at the beginning of the year, in February, the NESG convened a multi-stakeholder dialogue session to discuss these issues and start to, tease out what the recommendations would look like, what we need to do, what we need to pursue to ensure that we build our food systems and we can respond to this, to this situation. Within the policy brief that came out of that dialogue, the NESG identified a number of recommendations, and I've highlighted about 8 of those recommendations on these slides. We're not going to be able to touch on each of these recommendations today because there are lots, but our work studios today are going to be focusing on really deep diving into some of those recommendations and pushing ourselves to come up with actionable steps, activities, outcomes that are required to be presented to the National Food Security Council or the National Economic Council to consider as we think through implementing some of the outcomes that are coming out of this year's Nigeria Economic Summit. Of course, the first one is the need to that we need a National Food Security Council governance. And in this case, we believe that we need to start to bring in state governors into the National Food Security Council because a lot happen at the state level. We need to implement a national hunger response. I won't go through the details of the slides. I believe the NSG can share these slides with the participants. Of course, we need children at risk hunger response specifically. There is this one that is very critical that we're going to be really deep diving into today, which is the need to rethink financing to boost agricultural value chains. The truth is, if we're going to address the food insecurity issues that we are currently faced with, we need to start to rethink agricultural financing. We need to know and we need to accept that financing agriculture is different from financing every other sector. And we need to find a tailored approach to financing agriculture. The next slide, which is my last slide. There's a need for us to develop a robust national food security and accountability framework. This is important, and we need to be able to identify key performance indicators and assign KPIs to the different institutions that are responsible for driving different aspects of our food systems. We need to expand the food bank's operations across Nigeria. We need to strengthen the strategic food reserves. And the last one is for us to adopt a risk-based national food security framework. We need to look at the national food security framework from a risk management perspective. When we look at if we break down the food value chain or the commodity value chain from production to markets, we need to be able to identify the associated risks at each stage of the value chain. And we need to be able to identify institutions that are responsible for managing those risks and ensure that we hold each of those risk owners accountable. It is until then we can start to move the needle and get to where we want to be. So that is the presentation. We all know this. I just wanted to bring this presentation up to really prepare our mind ahead of the session that we have today, so that as we go into the work studios, we've been able to manage expectations and we know what is expected of us to really think through and what we want to have at the end of this session in terms of outcomes. So in terms of the work studios, or in terms of the session today, the way it's going to run is we're going to have, immediately after this, we would have a rapid brainstorm session in each of our work studios. Each of those work studios are led by my section or discussion leads. We're going to have about 50 minutes to really deep dive into each of those areas. And I want to plead that please let's stick to the topic. And as we discuss, let's have at the back of our minds that what we want to achieve from these sessions are specific outcomes that are actionable, that we can present to the presidency for implementation. After the 50 minutes of brainstorming session within each of the work studios, we would come back together and have a debrief. And after that, we can have some cross-fertilization where we all can contribute and, share a few thoughts around, different areas based on our experiences. And of course, we will summarize the day and that will be the end of the session. So in all, we're expecting to be here in 90 minutes. We started very, very late, so we're hoping that we'll be able to keep to time. And I think that's it. We should be ready. Dr. Ibrahim, are we ready for the work studios? So we're going to have the work studios here. There are 3. So maybe the easiest way to handle this is to have 1, 2, 3.
So probably you can just introduce the work studios. Studio 1 is this, studio 2 is this, and then people will join. So how do we arrange? Yeah, just 1, 2, 3.
Okay, thank you. So we would assume this is work studio 1, this is work studio 2, this is work studio 3. For Work Studio 1, we're going to be focusing on building a robust national food security accountability framework. That discussion will be led by my colleague and friend, Mr. Rufus Idris, the country director of AGRA. And within this work studio, we really want to understand how we can enhance the food security framework in Nigeria. What key components should be included in the National Food Security Accountability Framework in order to ensure effectiveness, to ensure responsibility and transparency across all levels of the food supply chain. So specifically within this work studio 1, we'll be looking at sustainable food production systems, reducing post-harvest losses, improving security in remote communities where we produce most of our foods, where we have our farmlands, and ensuring effective institutional coordination framework. Those are the key focus areas of the first work studio. The second work studio would be looking at how we can rethink financing to boost agricultural value chains. Discussion will be led by Mr. Akinka Akintunde, the CEO at FX Commodity Exchange. And here we want to really understand the specific reforms or the innovations that we should be implementing in financing value chains and institutions to ensure better access, efficiency, and support for farmers at all levels. So specifically, we want to understand how can we maximize existing agricultural funds that we have in Nigeria How can we enhance financial inclusion for small-scale producers, smallholder farmers, or SMEs in agriculture? How can we ensure financial institutions and policies are aligned with the unique needs of the agricultural sector? And lastly, how can we increase private sector investment in the landscape? The third work studio will be looking at implementing a risk-based approach for food security. Here, as I said earlier, we want to really understand how we can collectively design a robust risk-based national food security framework that effectively identifies, mitigates, and manages food security risk across the different levels of the value chain. So we really want to be able to estimate the risk factors and conditions and find ways of mitigating those risks to reduce the cost of funds, assessing country-level risk to food security, and identifying and mitigating future food system crises and target threats before they crystallize into serious market crisis. That discussion will be led by Ms. Abiba Suleiman, Development Manager at TGI Group. I think that will be the flow of the conversation. I should keep my mouth shut here and pass it on to the discussion lead. Thank you very much.
So we can make a round. So people can move across their work studios. They already have their work studio in mind.
So please feel free to move to any work studio of your choice. That you are seated in a particular place doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in that work studio. I just want to make that clarification. Thanks.
But you'll be the one guiding this conversation. We're going to lead it. So those are the three sections we'll be looking at. So let's start. The first one is what? I've not been communicating. What we have currently in terms of financing in the country, and I would like people from different areas of the value chain to help us drive this conversation. So what do we currently have? Financing solution. Is this available? If it's not, we don't have it. If it's there, it's beautiful, but we can't access it. If you can access it, yes, it's there, I can access it, but they are charging me 30%. It's too expensive. Okay, I can afford it, but to even get it out is a challenge. What do we have currently? Yes, ma'am. Grants and loans from government institutions, both local. We can capture that under government and insights. Thank you very much. To some extent, right? So we have institutions in place. So from a government perspective, we've created institutions required to make financing available. Right? Now let's go to the second one. We created all of these. Most of the administration and previous government for ensure that everybody. And the question is, why are we not getting financing? Why? What's broken? In Nigeria.
Coffee is not a popular value. So that obviously brings the fact that
data, I like that word. Data availability, data information. So to even finance, you don't have money. You can't predict whether you can pay, whether you can farm it. When you farm it, then markets, there's no data supporting that information for me as a financier. Thank you.
And it just might, this information it helps us to kind of diagnose, describe the problem, which is the point that and then make decisions.
Think is not for me.
And that already takes
And people that are they get it. So awareness from the part of the
government are making it together, looking at outcomes for
government is population power.
Yeah.
Insurance company. They are all of these things. Let's also give together awareness and grassroots. Awareness and grassroots. Risk. So we capture that as risk. What's the word now? Risk structure for financing, risk assessment for financing. Feeds you from data, awareness generated, then you should be able to profile the entity you want to give this risk to.
well, I think it's just building on the conversation around the dashboard, yeah, and how to explain it by having more in the space of national level, so that rather indicators that we don't have at national level, we also bring down companies that speak to indicators that companies for subsistence. I do have one for certain
one is that sounds projected yield of 20,000. It's not coming from because majorly it depends on rent. So what do? Is the PPP we are talking about, the partnership into the private sector, like the commercial land, you can enter 1,000 units. Government will come in. Sometimes your land will title provide the basic infrastructure. What are the basic infrastructure done that could enable around agricultural production? Government is about the partner together monitor special that will get that is the government is willing to take putting money in the private sector. Yes. And you can never get that every year buying fertilizer, you can't get it. Every year buying tractors, you can't get it. But you are able to control some natural factors.
Let me invest in infrastructure. Yes, I should not always be focused on I need to be more fundamental strategies. Infrastructure ensures that all year round there's a all verification that used to come in. Yes, how will that increase? Yes, I know that. Production infrastructure, very key. More investments in infrastructure, research,
about welfare agriculture. It's not all dependent on rain. So that is talking more about also about the risk. You started with the fact that as a financial institution, you have to loan money to primary producer because you are not sure someone at the end of the day. So risk is
if you are bringing money with the risk involved,
this is what I agree that or what kind of measure
what kind of indications you want to apply to that? Maybe people have thought they might find out, but I think the other that you want to make sure one of the issues that
Doesn't matter who is there.
I like the box that we have been trying not to go there. I thought we are addressing finances, so we are careful not to go there because the other sectors and the other groups also addressing that. But I mean, very precise, and thank you for bringing up that. And we need to define what are we talking about as our food security, because sir, in the mind of your cabinet, sir, I read their minds, and the mind says like, okay, food security is that we want to produce every food that we are going to eat. In the essence of it, we look at it, is it possible? And do we have countries of the world that produce all the food that they need to eat? And the truth is that it is inexistent. A good example is United States of America that produce a lot of food and import a lot of vegetables, banana from Costa Rica and the likes. So in the sense of it, are we talking about food sufficiency or food sovereignty? Security for me is that I want to eat food today and tomorrow. Where is the food coming from? Either I'm buying it.
Like you mentioned, the NELG put together a policy, and that is a recommendation that's one. That recommendation was taken to one component of this recommendation, and that's the national food security. What is this? There are many issues that are raised in that about how do you increase or making productivity increase within the 41% of our income. How do you ensure how small the access to good morning, ladies and gentlemen, how to reduce the issue around soil health. How do we increase soil health? How do we increase access?
I'll take a different perspective. I'll play the role of the new improve variety of seeds. How to get and you represent Federal Republic, President of the Federal Republic,
smart seeds.
So we want to talk about 5% adoption. Mr. President, right? Now, what's your take on that? I mean, what was like finance.
How do we do this framework? I
mean, what was like just governance,
where we're talking about
trade,
loss that we see.
So maybe we're going to look at 60%, we're going to address this in what perspective is
so how do we look at the issue of service loss and how do we address that?
Secondly, we're going to look at what's wrong with recommendations, what's wrong with the just come up with right and talk about what we need to do differently. And as they are all practitioners,
that should be
I think we know where this issue comes. So when you come and tell me that we need more
passionate
for production
That's what we do.
Tell me what we have on that's not what we bring and how that will go. That is and I think the fourth part of our
session we're going back to look at the entire house.
get more
What has to be the expert in the room, what to advise, which is what to keep on this how do you address
as president, I'm talking to
security challenges. But there are things that are as well as the ones who are focused
this is what I hope to be.
recognize. So that's which are within this framework. Having the production system.
Are we together?
How do we like reducing the standards loss like I mentioned earlier?
Any questions?
And last one, how do we look at effective institutional ambition framework that are working around us? How do you know what the people
So let's start. The first one is what?
so we can plan is doing for the vice president?
What do you have currently in terms of financing? And I would like you to point your different
As a discussion
areas of advantage to front of the discussion. So what do we currently have?
my boss is here. Just listen to him, get this feedback.
These are
Within this framework,
It's not
to ensure
if it's there, it's there. If you can access it, yes, I can access it, but I can't do it. It's too expensive. Okay, I can afford it, but you won't get it out. What do we have? Fine. Yes, grants and
so you can guide on this question.
local government. Sorry, thank you.
Let's say you don't have writing, but that's fine. Go first.
Yes, I was going to say, I think to make it easy for people to connect the concept, that might be a good idea. But actually, when I read the brief, my thinking was, you give us a different within, and that limits the scope of conversation. So let's not just focus on because the other thing to food security and consideration that outside of this.
Okay, let's hold that on.
So let's open but to provide those parameters, it's there for all. Let's not limit ourselves to those
So I expect how do we
We're being drowned out by the other team.
find a way to optimize it. Let's go. I'm just waiting on him to sort of like enumerate all of the thematic or this one.
Maybe I should stand up so I can project a little bit more. And then, yeah, I mean, I think for me, my initial starting point is we do have a number of frameworks already. And the people here will be familiar with CADA, which provides a framework for at least agricultural production and other dimensions, financing, governance, and so on. There is the food systems dashboard, which again provides a framework which looks at all the components of the food system from production to consumption. There is the food systems, FSCI, what's that again? Food systems accountability countdown initiative, which is a mechanism for measuring performance against the pathways that governments have signed up to. There is, I sit on something called the Expert Review Committee of the World Benchmarking Alliance, which has a food and agriculture benchmark, even though that's focused on businesses. The point I'm making is there is already quite a lot. Most of these are already signed up to by the government. So is the job here really creating one, or really focusing us down on using what the most appropriate one, or bringing it together? I would suggest, and if we're going to do that, my suggestion is, given where we are, let's not focus so much on things measuring inputs, apart from maybe financing, of course, because that's a big input issue, and really focus on things that measure outcomes, so that we can see where we're getting to, and things that we already have national indicators to measure. So most of these things I mentioned use indicators already existing, which are domiciled in the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Prosperity and Planning, and so on. So it's already there. So let's maybe simplify this by just doing a bit of work to bring all of those types of things that are already there together. That might be a start.
I completely agree. We are looking for better coordination of companies existing framework, or even investigating them as it relates to Nigeria specifically.
Yes, I mean, if I can push a bit more, the food systems dashboard actually has kind of done that. And it provides, this is the information we have. It helps us to kind of diagnose, describe the problem we are facing, diagnose the issues that are there, and then make decisions about what needs to change or happen. And that already takes data from CADA, it takes data from, national health, different data points, and brings it together, looking at outcomes for population growth, for business, for and so on. So I think it would be helpful to maybe start from that, rather than try to create a list.
Thank you. Even having a framework for that. Why do we have these and the next one is
so we started again just
that's fine. Risk assessment
feeds in from data, awareness generated, entity of this.
Well, I think it's just building on the conversation around the dashboard, and how we can deepen it by having more indicators at sub-national level, so that aside the broader indicators that we do have at national level, we also drill down into components that speak to, indicators that bring up data from some national sources. So we do have some for certain states, and looking on how, we can get more states on the board.
So that now can also feed into the larger discussion about state governors going to be involved. Absolutely, that puts absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think they're fully involved.
What about what Dr. Joe raised about this conflict with allocations to agriculture? I mean, if you're saying, CADEM says this is how much we should commit to agriculture and we will reap the benefit, of course, by fighting insecurity. The numbers you see, the national analysis refers to numbers in the federal budget. 3% times if we try 4%, sometimes even less than 3%. And yet we have some Nigerian state governments that have up to 15. I've seen 18% committed to agriculture on their state budget. Like Kebbi, like Bauchi, and many more. So it doesn't appear in the national scale how much the government is committed to agriculture, as if federal agriculture is the most important. I don't think so. I think it's probably the least important. The state, they fund agriculture depending on the resource endowment of that state. They exceed even the academic requirement for how much you should commit to agriculture. So I think my suggestion is, how do we tap into this overlapping statistic and say, actually, this is how much we're voting into agriculture. Not saying the federal is voting 2-3% and that is it. What about the states? They vote considerably. But we don't have a tally framework that shows this is how much Nigeria is spending on agriculture.
So maybe to build on that and also my point, frameworks, even the ones that are existing, they have nuts and bolts and they have, shall we say, key raw materials that feed into them, right? And the principal element is data, really. And so this is the context in which we then fall back and reflect on the reliability of the data that we feed into the indicators that enable us to be accountable for the policies that we've promulgated, etc., all of that, and to what extent they're reliable, and to what extent to which, despite the existence of these frameworks, policies still get made on an anecdotal basis and do not reflect those underlying conditions. Right? So is there a rigorous evidence-based approach to policy in agriculture, which is where you then come to his point about to what extent are the proportions of funding that government puts into agriculture, to what extent are they reflective of need and impact potentially, as opposed to the adoption of whatever international frameworks and benchmarks there are for how much is spent on agriculture. Mindful also too that, and this is in keeping with some of the themes on the other tables, government is not necessarily the only player on the funding side. We want to get the private sector players inside and into the space, and a lot of that's going to have to be risk-based because then it becomes, the more you bring in the private sector folks, then it becomes a risk and reward conversation because that's investment. And so data, what's the role of data and evidence? Are the frameworks and dashboards that we have, disparate as they are, maybe not as effective because the raw material, which is data that feeds into them, isn't robust enough.
Thank you.
Yes, there's actually there will actually be another breakfast session on Wednesday on that, right? Data, elevating the role of data and information in national food security committee. There's a breakfast session on Wednesday.
So what we're recommending here now would be that there should be more robust data.
Yes, and evidence so that it's more responsive
We have a very good system.
really the government and private sector. For example, where structures are put inside, and then as well with proportion, and how do we let the government to tie responses even to the population plus struggling to have one full meal a day. So I think the insecurity has huge implications for our populations as well, considerably more than we thought.
And I shouldn't go out and go back. So what should we capture in the sense of food security? The focus will not be on rural, that will always
I'm just saying as facets. Maybe when we say food security, we should disaggregate it to talk about food security in rural settings. So in urban settings, there is a lot of deprivation.
I think a good example is
Some people who are food insecure in the cities. So maybe advise the government to target urban political numbers not suggest. So people are missing the train thinking the rural people will have to fluctuate the other way.
since at that high level,
He made a suggestion on what quantity or what amount of percentage of budget actually is channeled to agriculture. I know in 2003, Nigeria as a government was a signatory to the Maputo Declaration. Are you?
No, not for me. I can hear you.
Okay. Well, what I'm trying to say is that in terms of budgetary provision for agriculture, Nigeria already signed an international treaty in 2003 in Maputo, where it was agreed that every African country, Nigeria taking the lead, should at least budget 10% for agriculture. But then it came to play during the Jonathan administration, where we had attacks. He was saying that some state governors, especially in the northern part of the country, even allocate above 12% to 15%. But they are seeing agriculture as one of the major mistakes. But then, what has been a major challenge is the conflict of interest, and it's a constitutional matter when you are talking about concurrent and non-concurrent. The state government will tell you that on agriculture they have their own special interest, and those were the things that actually worked against some of the achievements of ATA. So I want a situation where we can have a more robust synergy between the federal government and the state governments to see agriculture in the same perspective, so that where there are areas of conflict, we should be able to put that aside and look at food security. Like people will say, food has no denomination, whether tribe, religion, or whatever. If you are hungry, you are hungry. So we must be able to, either for the states to be able to align properly with some of the national policies and work as a team. We should look at that.
So your comment is touching a lot on, I think, the last point here, to ensure that adequate coordination between both national and the sub-national.
Yes.
So first of all, the point about investment made in the budget.
Yes.
Most time we look at the national and say, currently I think we're looking at national policy. So this actually is not to support how do we capture what is being done in the state as well? But the federal government will not implement this form of agriculture without the land that is the state. So I would like to demonstrate how whether you can capture that. To see that the coordination between state and federal when it comes to
some really good points that they're making. Looking at this for the one that I think is probably not, I haven't seen information on this before, so the thought is improving security in remote communities and farmers. And I don't know where you go or what kind of measure or what kind of indicators you want to apply to that. Maybe people have thoughts there might be useful to find out, but I think the others, there's a lot of information we can find. But that third one, which is critical again, because that's one of the issues that's really gets in the way of production, particularly. Is there anything people are aware of that they can refer to?
I think on the third point, the issue of open has to be addressed, because most of the conflicts between the nomads and the farmers are part of the forces complicating insecurity between the farmers and the population, especially in the rural areas. Gradually, the more civilized, unfortunately the two are both agricultural related, whether you are into livestock farming or crop farming, it's agriculture. But we must take our livestock to a level where we design the way by which the farmers, the nomads should be in cooperative form and restrict their animals to a particular portion rather than normal open grazing practice, which is completely obsolete. It's one of what is aggravating insecurity within the rural population, especially the farming population. Whether ranching or whatever way they're going to classify it, we must look for a way to discourage open grazing.
So when you say based on that, you say that this idea concentrated in ministry livestock, is that it moving the right direction? That's what's actually that.
And next, I try to look at the reports of the professor, his committee just submitted their report about 2 weeks ago. And people that were privileged to look at some of the highlights didn't want to agree with it because I think it's suggesting both open grazing and ranching, which was not acceptable to some part of the country, to some other groups. So people are, the ministry is okay, but it's a more complex issue because land, like we know, federal government does not own land. There have been lots of debates on this, on the Land Use Act, which has not totally aligned with the cultural belief of the people. For example, the federal government have no land. The land is domiciled in the state, and the state should know that the land is domiciled in the local government, and the local government knows that the land is domiciled within the community land holding. So, the federal government cannot, to an extent, yes, it's the Ministry of Livestock, but the issue of open grazing intermixed with ranching will definitely still not resolve the issue of security in the productive sector. Yes, the ministry is okay, but beyond the ministry, we must look at the area where there are vast land. There are areas where there are vast land that have been abandoned, which can be developed into ranches, especially the extreme semi-arid region that can be recaptured.
So for financing,
So to come with this
as a country, where do we have the
now we see anything, that's currently addressing number 3 that we know of.
So let's identify that
from government, private sector, organizations that are working to improve security in the
it becomes very clear. 500,000 hectares of land.
I don't think it's existing, I know of, but I think there's a need to harmonize the justice system and improving the security. I'll make reference to the Buhari era. One key insecurity issue we have relates to the agricultural sector. Is the farmers clashes, right? And I personally, I have not seen or heard any leader who have attacked these farmers being prosecuted or jailed. So with that, other headers will be encouraged to carry out such attacks. But when we have the justice system working, food security, and you are seeing on national television where they prosecute these attackers, that will help to curb the insecurity in the farmland. So I think that's one point to look at, harmonizing the justice system and the agricultural system to arrive at.
I think our dilemma, especially if you want to sort of like stick to the theme of the session, there's a difference between recommendations and how you arrive at the framework, right? And I'm assuming that's what we're doing. Right? And the problem with security is it's unfortunately sensitive, and maybe requires, I don't know, expertise, very, very particular for a particular form of expertise that I don't know that we have, or privileged information, perhaps even like to know that we have. Because what people can report to is, say in 2023, people sense that there would be a nature crisis in 2024 because there were farmlands that were largely abandoned on account of crisis, on account of the insecurity crisis. And then your response to that is, okay, then let's ensure that in food production belts there's an intensification of security around, say, planting season, so that farmers in those hills where food production is very intensive have a sense of confidence that going to food production seasons to return to farms, and so we see a better performance by harvest time, right? But if we think of security principally, especially on that level as the domain of the government, then it's likely that whoever would have the inside will be inside the government. I'm wary about the extent to which sitting around this table we will know what measures, what very specific metrics would apply to this in terms of creating a framework for multi-stakeholder accountability, because that's essentially what we're doing.
So the next 5 minutes, let's just get off this here. Yeah. The next 5 minutes will now start, narrowing down to what are we recommending now to
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
In 5 minutes, we'll start talking about what are we recommending. Talk about what we know, we'll put the questions. Now, what exactly are those actionable points and outcomes that want to be thinking about, that want to recommend government or power? So you want to say something, I'm sorry, so you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. What I have to say, let me step on that number 3 again to say, there's this law. If anything can go wrong, just assume that they will. With security issue, we can't discuss it, but we are seeing that there isn't enough results. Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm saying regarding number 3, we don't know what they are doing. People are working very hard, but a population of 220 or more, and it's very vast terrain, a lot of it hardly governed. I'm going to assume that the security agencies will not be able to do enough to stop that. That takes me to my own recommendation, going ahead of it, in discussing the perspective of sustainable food production systems. Let's recommend a
return and reinvigoration of Operation Feed the Nation. All of us here, we live somewhere. Use your veranda to produce cucumber. Technology has helped us. Let's see people do it. Let people farm in any little space they have. Let the civil servants, the public servants, the poor man, the rich man, let's assume that the people in the far-flung places cannot feed us because some people are keeping them from feeding us. Let the people in the cities who wear beautiful suits like us begin to contribute 1 onion per time in harvest time. That's my only input. Thank you.
But it matters whether we can be very productive at doing that, even if we all get it. Well, can be very productive because there's a question of yield and all of that.
Don't go into that mathematics. Let's first go. Sorry. Okay. He talked about productivity. You know, if every Tom and Harry has to have his own little farm. You know, in sales, when you're introducing these things at the marketing, the first thing is first of all to have it going. Have it going. Even there is a challenge with the young people understanding what farming is about. Let them see it from their verandas. Let's have it going. Later we talk about efficiency and non-efficiency.
Thank you. I think I'd like to address the third point, which is improving the security in remote communities and farmlands. I think the first thing is that we are not taking the issue about herders, farmers very seriously. We need a real commission that addresses the problems. You know, you have to first find out what is really the problem of the herder, what is really the problem of the farmer. Like your Truth Commission, we really need to form a commission that will bring all the stakeholders together to vent and really lay out their problems. You understand? And then the government will then support a resolution. We have to look. It's a cultural thing. It's a climate thing. It's a so many factors are responsible for it. And you can't just change people's way of life. The Fulanis have a way of life. You can't just tell them and restrict them to one place. So we have to actually gather people together and really hear them out. We're one country, so we must listen to each other and then prefer solutions. I think that's the only way. So there must be a commission to address these herder-farmer clashes and how they themselves resolve how to increase our production, give us access to our farms, and so on. I think that's the only way. Thank you so much.
I don't need to bring the cash. Very simple. Very simple.
So I need to do 10 the risk profiling is like leveraging data on the in fact, once IoT this is the risk this one risk or you can take out the stories. So this one I would say
and I couldn't hear you well. I say something like there are states where actually because the 10%, like up to 12%. Is that everywhere? If that's not everywhere, I think that should be also addressed. So talking about accountability, the time the state has taken to ratify that protocol, that is that institutional national and the institutional contributing. I think, when I think that's my mind. So I can see what I think take that. Yeah, and my last part is about security. I think I see the one side of it. It's not just about herders and farmers. It's also about all the security issues that Nigeria, and other countries close to Nigeria. And the security issues actually taking a lot of people from their own fields. People are fleeing about their fields. So when people are fleeing about their fields, and I think it's also important to understand here, because one of the things that is putting security issues is also a broken social contract. One of the reasons why we have more young people being involved for security movement that men don't have employment, they don't have access to resources. And for one time, they have no access to resources. They're actually ready to go to any type of industry. So I think the social contract is also important. What is the government doing to address the social contract?
Look at the situation in the rural area and the past, something that it's not going to go to fund because it's not a big gift. All the companies are going down. But it's going beyond the exactly. So how do we address that? Now, how do we address is becoming a law. Think about how many laws we need to but this somewhere, to go and strike and get them out of there. And the what they want to solve, actually ransom. There is a greater amount of so we're saying at the border to combine the it goes back to institutional and we are not explain how we fight, which is my point, right? To what extent? So how we do this? This require a lot of people around security experts seeing what's actually going on there. Along the path there's also the issue of community policing. I can tell you for a fact that every single community, when they see it's being faced, there's no way you know what they're there. But most times, though we've seen again some cases, those unknown cases also support a lot of charitable work or something, whatever, in that community. This person or people that enjoy the like that person, the guy complex kind of story, but here, I think with regard to expert intelligence, you need to actually crack that nut in that space. And again, this is why we know our enterprise or whatever land rights, it's going to be complex. Why do
especially lately, we hear of family rights. When they suppress the community and say family sell their livestock, generate that money. Okay, so that they were allowed to go to the farm. These are the currency. And then as soon as you hear the story, pushing them the response was shocking. So we're trying to follow this. We think there is publicity of the police is sharing the largest. And once we watch this, the police, they come back and kill them. Not the police, the police. So it's the green part I'm with you. I don't know how this is entirely working. The integrity of some of these policies, especially when they don't talk about extract farmers. These institutions that pay a fee and just replicate and enhance them. So it's I don't have evidence that police are capable. But I would leave the farmers as the police for them to say that.
The funds are available.
I hope there's no policeman here. I don't want to be in trouble.
I think the police union discussion we're having to come start and narrow down, I think we call come back together. So we want to go back and just see it again and just suggest you have data from each of these lines. So I guess we can start from sustainable then get there. So that's going to be captured within the national food security accountability framework for sustainable food. And this happens a lot in here. I think we go around addressing the climate change impact, how we make our food system more resilient. Right, then the shocks, the indirect shocks, the climate shocks, and like another industry. What do you think we can provide in this work? So what we think is clearly that we can from this side. Or if you don't have that yet, check another
Okay, so you can maintain your sitting positions so we don't disrupt the room as we start the debriefing session. Thank you very much. I'm going to be calling the discussion leads here, one after the other, to lead the debrief session. So when you come here, just, hello, one house, is the risk people that are holding us up. I know. So maybe you might want to also move for a little bit. So discussion leads, please. When you come here, I need you to, share just a summary of the conversation within the team or within your work studio, and then please make sure you highlight at least 3 key outcomes or activities that you believe we should take away from here, because those 3 outcomes and activities are very important for us. They are going to make it into the final reports that will be submitted by the NSG to the presidency. So it's very important that we highlight those 3 outcomes. There can be more than 3, but top 3 will be fantastic. Who wants to come first? Who is going first? Akin is going first? Okay, thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we had an interesting conversation in my own design session, which is rethinking agricultural financing. We were honored to have the President of the Federal Republic with us. I thought we would clap now. How can you have the President that came and we are not honoring him? So he wanted to listen to us, and what are the challenges? And we looked at it from 3 key aspects. The first being, what do we have? Do we have anything for financing in Nigeria? The second is, what can we do better around it? Is it accessible? Is it available? Can we work with it? And the third is, what do we need to change from what we have currently? And across all the strata, we looked at it. The first was, we have a lot of these funds available across the country, but the drawdown requirements may be something we are not aware of, not even talk of accessing it. The second part of it is the fact that there's a huge absence of data across the country that is almost impossible for us to be able to carry out financing effectively. The other issue or challenge we had was the fact that we don't have private sector players in the ecosystem. Given the fact that, yes, we have government institutions, but a lot of times, government institutions don't move at the pace of private sector. That's the first thing. The second thing is most government institutions are driven by the political waves, which makes it difficult for agriculture to be sustainably financed in the country, which is a huge problem for players in the market, right? I want to know that if I go and get money from any BOI, BOA, NISAL, if there's a change in administration, it shouldn't affect me because I have a contract with the institution. The other part we looked at, it revolves around awareness, communication, framework. What's the structure we have in place to ensure that from the government part, we're clear on what we're putting in place for agriculture, which also ties to the predictability part that we discussed earlier. There needs to be a clearly laid out plan in terms of the structures we are putting in place as governments to drive agricultural financing, right? So what's our 3-year to 1-year term, which I'll call short term? What do we have in place for the next 18, 24 months? When we have this framework clearly outlined and open to the public, then we can have conversations around attracting financing into the country, because anybody coming in knows that we've clearly structured what these funds will be used for, and diversion is not likely, and it's not likely going to be susceptible to political whims. I think a word we used was ensuring policy, right? How do we get insurance on the policy that we come up with to make it work? So that's the core. Those are the core of the conversation. And then what we agreed on is we need to have this framework in place. There's an untapped area which is around sustainable financing, which is becoming the norm globally right now. The quantum is getting bigger by the day. The cost is cheaper. How do we position ourselves to be able to access it? And a point was made very, very loudly that give women more funds. Give women more funds, include them more in the system because they are more reliable. They will always repay the facility, right? So how do we include more women-focused activities in the financing ecosystem to get a lot of financing companies and organizations into it? The other key part that we mentioned was the fact that we need to find a way to leverage private sector investments heavily. And what we discussed was, what are the structures we need to put in place? I think we came up with an idea around government being able to give a guarantee, either in cash or by virtue of who they are, governments, right? They should be able to give a base level guarantee that we can now pile in private sector, which could leverage that guarantee multiple times to drive more investments in the ecosystem. One of the first points we also agreed, or that was made clear, and I think resonated with a lot of us, is the fact that year in, year out, government spends money on financing importation of inputs, fertilizer, seed, tractors, everything. And the point is, as a smallholder farmer, I can't even access the tractors to use because it's not even cost efficient. Can the government pay more emphasis on ensuring that as a smallholder farmers, I can access all of these buckets of funds we have across the country, as opposed to focusing on spending a lot of money importing what might not be used, right? A key part of that is we need to ensure that rural financing works, and for it to work, data, identity must work at the rural level for financing to get there. So if we can't fix that identity gap, there's no way we can make a case to government to rethink what they spend money on to drive agriculture, right? Yes, we know we need seeds, we need machines and the likes, but if the smallholder farmers does not have the capacity to produce to their optimal capacity, then it won't make sense for us to do those importations and co. So data at the rural level is very, very key for us to be able to access it and then drive it. Am I missing anything? Infrastructure financing, right? We need to tie financing to infrastructure, which is the point from spend less on importation and more on local infrastructure that is required to drive it, right? So, for example, if you invest more in infrastructure like dams and the likes, right? You have the capacity to be able to plant a commodity we all love in this country, paddy rice, all year round, as opposed to it being seasonal. How do we ensure that as a government we can drive that? And if we have that in place, then financing institutions can easily come in and know that this is a value chain they can continue sustaining through financing and bringing more capital into this ecosystem.
Cost of governance to come down and redirect.
So I said mute your mic on that, sir. But you are bringing it up again. I think I'll say it again. I think it's something that bites all of us, right? It's like we're talking from two sides of our mouths. We say food security is key, but we're not putting funds, and we see funds going into other sectors and other things we perceive are not key to the survival of the country. So cost of governance, we can't overemphasize it. We can divert these funds to agriculture and still reap the benefits of agriculture, right? It's more like a delayed gratification, if I can put it that way. Invest in what matters now, you can enjoy your cost of governance in the future. But if we don't put the right structure in place, we'll be back to this food security issue before we know it and before we blink. So there was an interesting point that was brought up, which is, I don't know if that is the right word. Some people call it contiguous farming, some people call it communal farming, where we aggregate smallholder farmers across, right, because of the issue of C of O and access to land. We believe that collateral is a huge issue for financing, and we believe having that combined access to land could be a key to get collateral from financing institutions. Because if we come together, then we have a huge parcel of land that we can use to get guaranteed financing for our production activities. And when you have those kind of structures in place, it makes cost of a lot of items, especially mechanization, a lot cheaper, which you can access on a larger scale to drive production, which would increase yield and build it. The other part we discussed about it, we need to invest more, whether we like it or not, in research and development. We need to make it fun. That's what we used, right? Because there was a concern around younger people not coming into the ecosystem. Younger people will be more creditworthy than elderly people that are already going out. And the issue around food security we're talking about today is because less people are carrying out farming activity because there are more elderly, older people in the ecosystem. The younger ones like us are in the city doing something else, right? So we need a structure to we need to invest more in making the agricultural ecosystem something that people should look forward to coming into, and not a village, I can't think about it kind of thing for younger people. We need young people in this ecosystem. We need younger females in the ecosystem. And if we have this, we'll be able to attract more financing in different forms and shapes that will drive productivity up, hopefully get us out of this our food security concern as a country, and ensure that we have more private sector play. We can leverage on government to provide the basics that are required, and then we can grow our yield and productivity up as a country. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. It wasn't succinct, but it was very detailed. we still have to work together to really craft out what those top threes are, because I think it's really very important. I think some of the points you raised, I mean, all of the points are very germane, but I think some of them can actually go into, the other. So we have more comprehensive ones. Rufus, you want to go next? And please, if you have, some thoughts, additions, please, you can keep thinking or, thinking about them or writing them. After the debrief, we can take a few comments before we wrap up.
Thank you, Temi. Good day, everyone. I bring you greetings from Agra and the millions of smallholder farmers that we work with. I also bring you big greetings from Work Studio 1. That was my group, and we actually looked into the issue of building a robust national food security accountability framework. And within that space, we look at a couple of key areas there. We look at sustainable food production system. We look at post-harvest loss management. We look at issue about increasing security at the rural communities and farmland. Then we look at the issue of institutional coordination within the space. So it was a very good deliberation we had, and I'll be happy to share some of the things that we discussed with you. One very important one that came up in the early part of the discussion was mainly about the overlapping jurisdiction. So if you're going to build a food security accountability framework, first it's important to know who is supposed to do what, when, and how. So within that framework, there should be some kind of something that address the overlapping jurisdiction between the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security, and maybe the Federal Ministry of Budget and Economic Planning, and the Federal Ministry of Trade and Investment. And also now we have the Federal Ministry of Livestock as well, that we're doing some particular function. And also looking at how does that also play within the national and the sub-national. I mean, what are the states supposed to do within that entire framework? Because the federal government cannot on its own just generate ideas and implement without even getting to cascade to the state, and state cascading also to the level of the local government, with the local government autonomy coming up. The other part, it's about why do we even need to create a new framework? There's so many frameworks that already have some of the indicators that we're talking about here. We have the CADEP, the Nigeria is a signatory too, and Nigeria is still trying to work towards improving our scores towards that. We had the food system dashboard that have most of the indicators that we're talking about within this space. We have the food system countdown initiative and so many more others. So we're not saying that should we now still have another framework, or should we just get one of those frameworks that already have some indicators? If we have any missing indicator at the sub-national, importantly, how do we get it to be part of what we're tracking and make that more effective, as again build another layer of framework which we believe will be difficult and tedious to still be able to get that moving. Then also we talk about overlapping statistics. So if you're talking about accountability and we're judging by just what the national government is doing, and you say, oh, you've signed to Maputo Declaration to do X in terms of investment in agriculture, and our current national budget is around 2%. But we're saying other states are doing around 10%. They're doing 15% investment into agriculture in their budget. How do we take that into account to ensure that the data is not overlapping and we cannot really get the accurate information in terms of the statistics? How do we make that count overall to see how much is being spent in the country will be a good area to look at. Then also in terms of data, and that comes to data again, to be able to make the right kind of evidence that's required to also be able to be accountable for some of those things. So the issue of data came up, and I mentioned, my brother from FX mentioned that data also is the big issue that came up in that space. So I believe data in agriculture, data for evidence, data for decision making, also for accountability is also important to be able to bring into the play there. Then I think one critical area that also came up, it's the issue of the security at the rural community and also farmland. The first thing is that we tend to assume and think that food insecurity is large in the rural areas. The recent report has shown that even in urban areas, there's serious food security challenges within people living in urban areas. So if we put our target on rural areas and we're missing the fact that we have a lot of people in the urban areas that's actually suffering, then it's a misaligned target and strategy. But for us, we feel it's also very difficult for us, not being security expert, to want to deliberate and dive into security issues and bring solution. But what we can say clearly within that space is that we know that there need to be a strong alignment and intentionality in government fighting insecurity challenges, because everything that we've mentioned, sustainable food production system, post-harvest loss management, mechanization improvement, soil health, seed system, we cannot get to implement them if we can't even get to the farmland in the first place. So that security component is the biggest of ours. So we recommended some things there, and what we're looking at that time was that, one, if we look at the issue of this being caused by the farmer header crisis, there have been some current responses to that. How do we ensure that the issue of open grazing, the issue of ranching, and like the government is working on now, is being taken into account? We have a recent report that came from the new Ministry of Livestock, which Ajega just reported back, that will address some of those issues. If we look at the issue of how do you even handle cases that have been reported in communities, so we feel that we should be able to harmonize the justice system to show how do we penalize people that are caught in the act of committing or causing insecurity in the remote areas and in the farms. So somebody was even saying, can we go back to the days of looking at something like we used to have a program called the Crime Fighter. I don't know how much that helped, but can people see that people that have committed this crime are actually being dealt with and handled, and can actually send a signal to others not to? Most cases we've not seen that happen, and villagers don't believe it happens. In fact, we get to a point where communities are now paying to be allowed to access their farm and not be kidnapped. So belief is beyond just the farmer header crisis. It's gone beyond that point. We'll talk about also the need for continuous engagement within stakeholders to talk about these issues and continue to agree and align on how best to address the issue. Just with community members, farmers, stakeholders, they've been involved in those kind of deliberation. Then I think one important one also the issue of unemployment in rural areas. So there's no way we can continue to say we want to stop this insecurity impacting on food security without addressing the food issue of unemployment among our young people, either not having the available job for them to go into, or not even getting them enrolled in the right kind of education at those rural areas in some communities to make them try to forge or look for a meaningful life compared to being enrolled to be involved in some of this vice and this crime. And I think I would like to wrap up to just say that based on all those discussions, what we agreed is that we just believe that there are frameworks in place. The Ministry of Agriculture currently have their own agenda point of how they want to tackle and address food insecurity in Nigeria. The federal government and the presidency had made several pronouncements and several policy documents here and there to say how they want to tackle insecurity with strong indicators and numbers and deadlines, timelines there. I think we just need to ensure that there's transparency and accountability on that, how that's been implemented. Government want to increase the amount of land under cultivation in Nigeria by X. We've seen that in Mr. President's document. What is the transparency in that, and how is accountability in how you're implementing that, so everybody see how that's happening within that space. The presidency want to increase amount of land under irrigation that's being used, so we can move away from heavily depending on rainfed agriculture. How are we tracking that? What's the benchmark? By when will what happen, and who is doing what, whose role is doing what? Issue around soil health. Fertilizer was recently distributed to farmers. It was distributed, but was it to farmers is another question. And the channel through which was distributed, will that help us achieve what we want to achieve? So I think some of those things are what we should look at: roles, responsibility, accountability within that space, and better coordination between the national and subnational. It's critical if we must address our food security challenges. Thank you. I don't know if many committee members, my members, any other thing that I left out that you want to add? We're good? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Please, let's start for Rufus. Thank you very much. It's very comprehensive, and I didn't expect anything less from that team as well. And something that clearly resonates is transparency and accountability, across the board, and the need for that effective coordination mechanism between national and the states, level, stakeholders. Very, very important. We need to get a point where we start to draw the lines around what the Federal Ministry of Agriculture is responsible for and what the Ministry of Budget and Economic Planning is responsible for. And of course, what the presidency is responsible for. And all of these have to be, put together in a really clear manner that shows very clear target for the National Food Security Council to pursue. So thank you so much for that submission. Aja, over to you.
He's telling me to keep to time when every other person took their time. Please, we have things to say. Okay, so very quickly, our topic was implementing a risk-based approach for food security. And this is just to say that as we are coming up with all the solutions and all the strategies for food security system that works, we have to also be very conscious that there will be things we have to mitigate ahead. There are risks we need to identify and prepare for before we're hit with them. So again, we looked at these things from different angles. We looked at the availability component, we looked at accessibility, we looked at affordability, and all of those things that are threatening, and sufficient access, sufficient availability and affordability of food across all of our systems. We also looked at it from external risk components and internal. So external being those things we can control, we cannot control, and internal being those issues or risks that are sort of within our purview of, and we can control. So external, we identified the pandemic. Obviously, we saw how that affected food systems, especially as you had logistic constraints, in access to inputs, distribution networks were fragmented and affected because of the lockdown and associated issues during the pandemic. We also saw with the Russia-Ukraine war, obviously, those two countries are major exporters of fertilizer and fertilizer ingredients, to most parts of the world. So with the conflict in that part of the world, we saw how that affected input costs. I think from 2021 to 2022, agri-input costs went up by over 100%. That's significant for food production. That translates into cost of food, processing, and whatever it is eventually. Again, you have the instability, regional instability. So all of the conflict around our area, whether it's internal or within the region, within the ECOWAS region, has somehow affected our food systems as well. Then internal, we identify climate change impacts. We've seen what flooding has done recently. I think NEMA recently published that just between June and September this year, over 1 million hectares have been destroyed. Over, I think, 450,000 farms have been destroyed as well. These are critical issues that obviously significantly impact food production and availability as well. Then you have the conflict and insecurity risks. I think prior speakers have identified those risks, and that's a factor of how, like the prior speaker said, farmers have to pay to go to farms. They are being kidnapped on their farms. They are afraid to go and farm, and that has significantly affected productivity in that farmers are now producing less, cannot go and expand areas of cultivation because they are not secure enough. So that's a critical issue, and a risk as well. Then infrastructure deficit, and I think I'm going to bring irrigation here because I think we spoke about irrigation much further. But again, we are reliant on only one farming season significantly. We're largely reliant on just the rain-fed farming season because there's no irrigation. Now, with our rising population, that is not enough to feed us. So we need to really produce more than one farming cycles. Can we do 2? Can we do 3? Is there irrigation infrastructure? What are we doing to ensure that farmers have enough irrigation resource to cultivate beyond just the rain-fed farming season? Again, that is very vulnerable and exposed to flooding, right? How are we ensuring that farmers are able to cultivate beyond one farming season every year? Then we have the labor deficit as well. I think someone spoke about the youth moving to the urban centers because there's no incentive to farm. It's not attractive, right? So again, what are we doing to incentivize youth inclusion, women inclusion in farming? How we, what are we doing about drudgery and all the labor, the capital and labor-intensive practices that are still prevailing in our production systems as well? And then we had a point on cooling and preservation, and that's really about, I think, that logistic gap where you have storage gaps as well. So again, that further contributes to post-harvest loss. Now, if you come to aquaculture and tomatoes, vegetables, because of that significant gap in infrastructure to support the storage of those segments, there's so much losses that are being recorded, you know? And then we also mentioned poor seeds. So poor seeds is a significant problem because farmers keep recycling old seeds. They don't want to adapt. And that's, I think, a factor of as well behavioral change. Do they even know? Are they even aware that they have their better seeds that are that are resistant to some of the problems, disease resistant, heat resistant, for example? Are they aware? Is it available? Is it accessible? Is it affordable for these farmers? And then again, like I said, that's a factor of yield. So again, as much as our farmers are continuing to use poor seeds, that will translate into poorer yields, and that will translate into the poor volume of food that we keep getting out of it every year. Then the knowledge and awareness gap, I think I just highlighted that in prior risks that we identified, that there's a lot of gap in what is even known on the ground. Over 80% of the food that we consume is produced by rural smallholder farmers. Do they have access to knowledge? Do they even know what they're doing? I think one of those things that we also looked at was, so we have, obviously, as you know, lots of our exports, are being affected by high chemical residual levels when we take them to other countries and they're rejected. And that's a factor of the application of inputs that our farmers, are used to. I mentioned one example about how sesame farmers, when yields were dropping, they just kept adding and adding and adding fertilizer. They didn't know any better. But that was a significant problem because then the food becomes poison and they do not know, right? So again, what are we doing about creating knowledge? Where does private sector comes in enabling that accessibility for farmers to even get access to capacity building and trainings on these issues? Then the low quality of agri-inputs. So again, where you have over-application in some cases, our agri-inputs are not of very high quality. What are we doing about that? What are we doing about ensuring that our pesticides, for example, are not chemicals that are banned in other countries? Who is paying attention to this? What regulatory practices do we have in place to ensure that these are risks that are identified and mitigated early on? Then we have the research and data gap as one of the risks that we identified, again, linked to information. A lot of the practices are still very obsolete. We're still reliant on, poor farming practices that are not climate adapted. What are we doing about these issues? We identified fragmented markets. Now, after all of the farming, farmers do not have guaranteed markets for their produce. That contributes to post-harvest losses. That disincentivizes farming in subsequent farming seasons. There's no fair pricing where you don't have access to very connected or linked markets, where you don't know who you're selling to, where you have lots of middlemen that are shortchanging smallholder farmers. So that's something we really need to identify and fix ahead. Okay, yeah, so we also had the EUDR as one of the external risks. So we had the European Union Deforestation Regulation that is critical to our exports. Now, as we're looking at food security, we're also looking at all of the segments, whether it's for domestic and export markets as well. So now, what regulations are in place domestically? And as you know, a lot of these things are broad-based. They cover us as well. So we're not saying that, that's just the regulation for the EU. It doesn't affect us. But the question is, if the food is not of good quality for those markets, why are we okay to consume those foods here in Nigeria? Why are we not doing something about consumption locally as well? Then over-reliance on imports is something that we identified. And I think here is also linked to the policy inconsistency that I think I'm going to highlight subsequently. But the question is, we need to know, are we about producing food to become self-sufficient? I mean, we're not obviously going to be fully self-sufficient, but if we're producing food, are we driving for mass production so we do not have to be reliant on imports to survive? It's critical. And they'll tell you that food security and sovereignty are linked, because unless you can control your food, you're at the mercy of whoever is selling food to you. And we saw during COVID that certain people started to, restrict exports because they wanted to feed their people. So we have to really be serious and prioritize food production, because that's the only way that we can even be fully sovereign. Otherwise, we're at the mercy of whatever external shocks, whatever pandemic is coming on in the future, we do not know. But these are things that have a significant impact on our food systems if we're not prepared ahead. We also had financial exclusion. I think they mentioned it, but again, this is a risk with regards to what farmers can access. and how they can access credit to produce more food. So unless that risk is mitigated, unless farmers can easily participate and access formal credit, access insurance services, for example, unless that system is functioned in such a way that farmers can easily access financing, can easily get payments for their food, for their produce, we'll have a significant problem, because otherwise I think that also contributes to insecurity. So here's another example, very quickly, is that people in most rural farming areas do not have bank accounts. So when they harvest, everybody takes all of their produce, all of the bags of whatever they've harvested to the farms, and they get paid in cash. That's a significant risk. You're carrying bags of cash home. Of course, bandits will come after you. Of course, people will kidnap you. You don't have bank accounts. So that's also something that has overlapped and is now contributing to, the rise in insecurity across these areas that we're facing now. Then I mentioned skills and capacity gaps. So extension services, there's a significant gap in access to extension services. Again, we're still reliant on old, obsolete farming practices. Then climate risk insurance, we do not have that. It's not prevalent, and that's a significant issue. I remember prior when we were talking to certain insurance companies about insuring our farms against, multi-peril risk, and they're like, we don't want to touch flooding, because everything just goes and there's no way to recover anything. But the thing is, there has to be regulations. If it's a risk that is a climate-related risk that is out of our purview, out of our control, why are insurance companies saying they don't want to touch that? What is the regulation? What is government regulation in place, or what government regulations are in place to ensure that that protection is available to farmers that require it? Then someone mentioned weak and corrupt regulatory and agricultural institutions. So we're trying to say it was it was weak, but he kept insisting that it's not enough to just say weak, because if there are people that are there and are not doing what they are doing, then they are corrupt, right? So yes, that's also a factor of people not doing their jobs. And unless we have these systems and institutions that are supposed to strengthen our food systems doing what they ought to do, what they're supposed to do, we'll continue to have these problems, right? So we really, that's one of the significant risks we identified as well. Then soil degradation as well. I mentioned over-application and inputs, poor practices. Our soil are becoming increasingly infertile. What are we doing to restore soil nutrients as well? Weak regulation and quality. I think so. The UNICEF representative that was on our team mentioned that beyond just food systems, we also had to look at the quality of the food and the nutritious components of the food, especially for young children. So what are we doing? What regulations are in place to say this food must meet certain quality standards before it's rolled out to the market? And then over-application, I mentioned that. Okay, so very quickly, I'm just going to run you through the solutions and mitigants that we identified. So in no particular order, we had strengthened food systems, obviously. So what weak systems do we have in place? What do we need to do to strengthen them? Then advanced conflict resolution mechanisms, both internally across the region and internationally. Internationally, we are participants or we are members of international organizations and regional organizations. What are we doing to advance interest? Because again, anything that happens within the ECOWAS region affects us whether or not we like it. So what are we doing, to drive for peace building and conflict resolution across these areas? And then adapt local production systems to both international and domestic regulations. This is where I mentioned the EUDR. We need to make sure that even our internal regulatory systems for food are up to international standard. It's no longer acceptable to just be basic because we are hungry, we just need to eat, right? Then widespread deployment of climate-smart agricultural mechanisms. Obviously, again, what are we doing to mitigate the impact? We can't just sit back down and say every year floods destroyed so 1,000 hectares of land. What have we done in preparation ahead? Right, conflict mitigation, I've mentioned that. Financing of local manufacturing of farm equipment. I think one of those risks I mentioned earlier was, again, the dearth of equipment and infrastructure. So this is where we need to actively finance for local manufacturing. Again, equipment for us here is not necessarily the large tractors and stuff. For our farmers at our level, we're happy to have a mass deployment of handheld pullers, the small stuff that just helps them to do things faster and cultivate even more land, to up our food productivity. Then trainings, capacity building, and youth inclusion. We said uniform agricultural policies. We need to know, like I said, where do we stand on food systems? Are we prioritizing imports? Are we prioritizing local production? Whatever it is, we need to have those codified in such a way that it's clearly communicated and it's uniform in such a way that everybody in that system understands. Then adapting simple and scalable technologies for storage systems and logistics. Again, this is part of that whole market fragmentation that we need to fix to ensure that there's less post-harvest losses. Drive for local production of certified seeds and enlightenment and incentives. So again, what are we doing to incentivize farmers to stop recycling old seeds? Are we enlightening them enough? Are we telling them this is better? Are we demonstrating the potential of using improved seeds? And then early warning systems. What are we doing to prepare ahead? What sort of regulatory framework, or structures do we have in place that helps to identify and communicate these risks ahead, to relevant parties before they even happen? Investment in research and linkages. So one thing was also the dearth of research at the moment. Are we linking industry and academia? All the research that's coming out of our academic institutions, how is it feeding into industry activity? And then commodity exchanges, obviously value linkages, which is what, is one of the solutions or mitigants for, addressing the market fragments that we have. Then deliberate policy on nutrition, like I said earlier. Financial inclusion, we've mentioned that's something that would then address all of the fragments that we're facing in that market. And then women and youth inclusion, I think I probably would have said that earlier. Private sector engagement. A lot of these things we've mentioned will not happen unless you have private sector people pushing it. If they make it part of their business models, if they plug it into what they're doing, it will become profitable for them. There will be an incentive for them to continue doing it. If farmers that I work with know enough to give me quality produce, I will keep enlightening them. I will keep investing in their trainings. So there has to be that incentive. Government really needs to put private sector in the front of this thing so that implementation can be sustainable over time. I'm going to stop here. I don't know if I missed anything. Did I miss anything? Thank you. He said, no, you didn't miss. Thank you.
I think she deserves a better round of applause for that. That was a fantastic dimensioning of the risks, landscape, framework. It's just very comprehensive. Thank you so much. We're really far gone in our time. Fortunately, I'm not going to be able to open up the discussion for additional comments anymore. The Vice President is going to be getting him very soon, and they are going to lock the doors 30 minutes before his arrival. So we would want to maybe take tea or coffee before we go to that session for those of us that are going for that session. But just to wrap up very quickly and say, this has been a very brilliant conversation, all through, right from where we started up until now. This is really great, and I'm hoping, and I will discuss this with the NESG, for us to be able to have an opportunity to, individually present this to the National Food Security Council. Because, beyond just putting together the communique and presenting it to the president, I think it's important for us to actually speak to those facts, and those outcomes. And we're hoping that, the NESD has done it many times over the years, that many of the very significant shifts in our systems or in our economic systems have really been specific recommendations from the Nigerian Economic Summit. And we believe that NES 30 will not be different at all. We believe that with these recommendations, the National Food Security Council already has its hands full with a lot of insight for them to consider going into the next few years as the country, as Nigeria continues to really push on this path of food security. And when we say food security, we're talking about food self-sufficiency and food sovereignty. And the hope at the end of the day is that we're able to address this trilemma. I used the word trilemma at the beginning. I said it's a trilemma of issues around food affordability, food accessibility, and food availability. We need to make sure we really address that trilemma and ensure that we have food for everyone in Nigeria. Where we have enough food here, we can start to think about actually exporting food to other countries. And why not? Why not? Whether we like it or not, we're already exporting food to other countries, through informal trade networks. And that really is going to continue to grow. Nigeria is in a very strategic position. I tell people when I travel anywhere in Africa, I say, I just tell them, well, sorry, because I believe that we're supposed to be their bigger brothers and bigger sisters. So we're supposed to produce much more than we can eat and feed other people. So it's a shame that we're not able to produce what we can eat, you know. So this is really very fantastic conversations, and I would like you all to give yourself a very wonderful round of applause. You've done really fantastic. And please let me appreciate my discussion leaders again, one more time. And if you're not stingy, you can also give me a round of applause. I think that's right. Thank you so much, and see you around.